What I'm intrigued by this particular story is a young woman, an alleged victim of some form of sexual abuse or sex trafficking, said something existed and then retracted that claim. And she made these allegations against very powerful men. I want to know whether or not that retraction was entirely her doing,
Yeah.
or whether she might have felt some sort of pressure otherwise. I think there's a public interest in that. I think that is a story. I think I want the world's best journalists looking at that.
There is another story on the front pages of many of the papers today, aside from the post office scandal, and that is another story about Jeffrey Epstein. It's a story about sex tapes. It features some of the most famous men in the world. It's gone right around the planet, but it's not straightforward. It relates to a lot of documents released by a New York court connected with a case involving the convicted sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell. But the woman who made the allegations, essentially that Bill Clinton, Richard Branson, Prince Andrew, amongst others, feature in explicit videos with young women, she was Sarah Ransom. She subsequently retracted those claims. Now, all three men have made denials. Another man caught up in those claims is the famous defence lawyer Alan Dershowitz, and at one point he represented the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. He told Stig earlier on today that innocent people had been caught up in the scandal.
Look, there can be very little doubt of Epstein's culpability. He admitted it. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts. Ghislaine Maxwell is different. Her case is on appeal now. But I think the main point is these headlines all over the world are not about Epstein and Maxwell. They're about Clinton. They're about Branson. They're about me. They're about Prince Andrew. They're about other people. And it's the credibility of the accusers against some of these other people that has now been challenged by these emails, particularly the smoking gun email in my case, where it shows how the frame up began and why it began. Now the very woman, Sharon Churcher, has now said she believes that I was completely innocent. But nonetheless, she did suggest that my name be put into this, and that's caused me and my family enormous grief.
But you never settled with her or anybody else. And the fact of the matter remains with Andrew, I suppose, Prince Andrew, is that he settled. He made an offer to the woman who made claims about him, Virginia Giuffre, and people, I presume, are still entitled to read something into that, aren't they? I mean, there is a settlement there. It wasn't an acceptance of guilt, but it's a settlement nonetheless.
Well, I think he made a terrible mistake. I suspect he was pressured by his mother to make that mistake. If he had fought that case, I believe he would have won.
That was defence lawyer Alan Dershowitz. I mean, Quentin, obviously, some of the men that we're talking about who've been implicated in these documents, they've already been fairly well dragged through the newspapers in terms of their reputations. But just because there is a rumour about them, it doesn't mean that they are guilty.
No, it doesn't. An amazing smear operation, this. An American court documents, any journalist knows, are really undiluted paraffin, can be, because people make all sorts of allegations in American courts, quite often looking for some sort of out-of-court settlement. And so you get some wild things being said. And last week, I mean, for instance, in this story, we had Stephen Hawking was involved in alleged orgy. I mean, orgy. The man could only move an eyebrow at the time, but there's all sorts of strange things. And it's being written up today, this island where Epstein at his parties is being called Pedo Island. I mean, one needs to be very careful here legally, but there are photographs in the paper. No connection with Pedo Island, but the connections of the paper, photographs in the paper of Lord Mandelson being sized up for a belt by Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, it's just an extraordinary smear, the sort of thing that's going on. There is no crime in being a hedonist. There's no crime, actually, in being a voluptuary. Some of the links being made here are high-flown, I think is one way of putting it. But it's all very readable because we little people we draw some pleasure from reading about the alleged sybaritic goings-on at the house of a man who's long dead.
Kezia, should we be ignoring this kind of stuff? As Quentin says, you know, American court documents, these kinds of releases, they are often full of things which you would never be able to prove. I mean, clearly all the papers have written it up as such. You know, these stories have since been retracted, but they are there nonetheless.
Well, I start from the premise of saying I get no pleasure whatsoever from reading about these stories. I find them deeply uncomfortable and don't really know where to file them or how to process them, because I start from the premise of wanting to believe the women at the heart of these cases. And what I read in these stories are a series of vulnerable women, victims of alleged sexual abuse or sex trafficking, who are making allegations against not just one, but several of the most powerful men in the world. Now, that's really uncomfortable, that's really difficult, but there's something there, right? There just is something there, which is why we repeatedly go round in circles covering the story, trying to get to the truth of what exactly has gone on here, because there is an imbalance. We know that there are some convictions in place. We know that other deals have been done, as Stig described in that package. It does whiff. And for long as it whiffs, I think we need journalism to be exposing it and talking about it and writing about it, as difficult as that is.
But I guess the problem is, Kezia, the way we all do it, not necessarily us here, but the human nature thing is to not go into the detail and try and, because it's impossible to necessarily bottom out precisely what is true. You end up with, if you look at the headlines of this story, it is Prince Andrew in a sex tape, in inverted commas, with the third paragraph saying this claim has already been retracted. So where does this take actually Me Too and legitimate concerns about the abuse of men in power, which, as you say, is around and stinks, and there's been many documented examples of it? I wonder if this ultimately dilutes the environment where those things should be properly considered.
It might do, but the way that you've just described how the stories are written is really important, because we, the reader, can come to the same conclusion that you have, that word in the headline is in inverted commas, and there's a very strong disclaimer in the third paragraph. We should all be trusted as intelligent enough to come to those conclusions ourselves. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be in the paper, right? So what I'm intrigued by this particular story is a young woman, an alleged victim of some form of sexual abuse or sex trafficking, said something existed and then retracted that claim, and she made these allegations against very powerful men. I want to know whether or not that retraction was entirely her doing, or whether she might have felt some sort of pressure otherwise. I think there's a public interest in that. I think that is a story. I think I want the world's best journalists looking at that.
Well, no doubt they are already looking at that, and will continue to do so over the next couple of days.